Well, thank you so much. No, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to speak. One of the first things I actually wanted to do was to just understand who was in the room. So basically, can you tell me a little bit about product management roles? So for instance, who is like a VP of product, who's overseeing other product managers? All right. What about direct product, where you're leading the product team? Okay. Who are some of the other folks that didn't raise their hands? Anybody? All right, nobody. Okay. Do you in terms of your reporting structure, do you have direct influence in terms of folks that you can hire and fire, the actual product teams, or is it basically controlled by engineering? So who is it controlled by engineering? Okay. What about that you have access to this directly, where you can make these decisions? Who is going to be on your team? All right, got it. Just wanted to understand exactly who's in the room and the roles so that I can more appropriately direct the talk. And actually, you already asked the other questions, what kind of experience you had with offshore product management. So has it been positive? Who has had very positive experience with offshore product management? Okay, a few hands. How about a really negative experience? Okay, we have a few hands there too. So I guess the rest is neutral. All right, yes? Yeah, I'm referring to the whole team, so in essence that you can control the product delivery, not only the product management function. So that's what I was referring to. Who has full control over the product delivery? Okay, got it. All right, well, let me tell you a little bit about who I am. This is... Oh, here we go. Okay, got it. So this is more of a disclaimer. Again, I'm going to be speaking from my own personal experience in product management. And as you introduced, I spent about 10 years being the CTO and Chief Product Officer of Tonic Health, which is a healthcare company. We provided patient intake forms for large hospital systems. So basically fill out those forms on the iPad and the web. So worked with, we had millions of patients who use their software on a regular basis. And all our product team was offshore in Ukraine. There's about 120 folks that I've managed. And currently right now, I'm the co-founder and chief product officer of Turnkey Labs, where I basically decided to take the experience, and it was a positive experience, and kind of bottle it up and help other companies who are struggling with offshore teams, create them more effective. The other thing that I really, through all the years, when I thought about it, what I was really focusing on was actually creating and shaping the culture of how do you create the teams that take charge and are responsible for product delivery from the get-go. So that's really what I'm dedicated to and what I want to learn from you guys, because every one of us has a different set of experience, so I want to make this as interactive as possible so that we can all learn from each other. So what's on the agenda? The main things that we want to talk about are three things. The first one is the promise and the pitfalls of remote teams, because again, we do a lot of offshoring, a lot of folks use it. So why do we do it? And what are some of the experiences that we've had? The other one is the framework that creates effectiveness when interacting with remote teams. And then let's focus on how to apply the framework to your situations as well. So if you are having issues, you need to do some troubleshooting, we can help figure that out. All right, so what is the promise? The main reason why folks basically use offshore teams, as you know, is cost. Cost is usually the primary issue. And the other one is they wanted to access local talent when it's hard to recruit and retain. I mean, we know all of this. Sometimes you also believe that you may be able to scale up faster. I'm not sure if this is true 100% now, but in the early stages when we were first going to these locations without other companies where the competition wasn't stiff, this was more appropriate. Right now it's a little bit hard. So what's the reality and what does the landscape look like in terms of what people offer? I mean, to me, oftentimes it feels like a bazaar. We get all these crazy emails. Everybody has a remote team that is amazing and can solve all your problems. And I wanted to, how many of you gets those emails every week, right? They're pitching something. So I kind of wanted to break it down from, what I've seen. One of them is folks will either build teams directly themselves that they will own. Again, they're creating a subsidiary. The other one is creating some sort of version of a captive team, either via BPO or like company, a dedicated team, we're outstaffing, and I want to talk a little bit about the difference for the way that I understand that, because again, we use the same terms, but we may look at them differently. For me, a captive team and having that more direct control is really understanding salaries and understanding how people get compensated and having the transparency and control over the process. So who you hire, who you fire, etc., and understanding what their incentives are. If that part is obscure to you, and you don't know what's incentivizing them, that most likely you're working with some sort of outsourcing or outstaffing agency. Because again, and this can be challenging, we'll talk a little bit about the challenges there later. And then there's the project-based one. So what this talk is gonna focus on of how do you really manage your own team, or if you have a captive team. Because again, the other ones are much harder to create alignment and to create efficiencies if you don't have those tools in place. So what I mean is for instance, let's say instead of creating a subsidiary, you have an entity that is located in that geography that's facilitating payments, all the contracts, you're protected legally, all the IP is protected, but you still have transparency and control. So you're paying them some sort of fee, whether per person, percentage, or flat fee per something. So I think one of the companies, for instance, comes to mind is EPOM, I think, from Eastern Europe. They did that, where there's like a flat fee per person, and you kind of understand what folks are getting paid. And there's more rise of that because of that transparency. And again, the reason why I emphasize this point too is a lot of outsourcing companies, from having known a lot of folks who come from outstaffing firms, the top people may be incentivized to increase the size of the team, and they will get comped and bonused on that. So how can you ask them to give you a product strategy or give you an architecture when they're incentivized by increasing the number of people on your team? So that's what I'm really talking about. Like, if that is obscure to you, it's really, really difficult to make things work without understanding that. So I'm a big advocate of having transparency, because that transparency is the thing that allows you to have control. So actually, let me pause here and get some read on the room. How many of you know exactly how this works within your team, or how many of you know that? Okay.
Actually, I have a question.
Yep.
I'd like to get clarification. When you say offshore team, and then you also mentioned outsourcing companies, etc., are these offshore team members employee of your company, or are they sort of consultant or contractors working through outsourcing firms for your company, on your projects?
So the two options that I recommend where you have that control is either being directly involved there, where you have a subsidiary, or you have direct contracts. Again, you don't necessarily need to have a subsidiary to work in those countries, but if you have a direct contract and you're paying folks directly, you have the same impact. You don't necessarily need to be there. But the other one is if you don't want to have 50 different contracts, you don't want to deal with the hassle of creating a subsidiary, working with a company that exists locally, but you have the transparency. Those are the main things that I'm advocating for, because again, that's the foundation for everything that we're going to talk about. Without this, it's going to be relatively hard for you to implement some of these things. So let me talk a little bit about, so what does the dream team look like? I mean, this is basically a description of every single dream team that we want to build, whether offshore or not. There are a couple of key traits that we want to foster. They really want to understand the mission of the company and the purpose of that team, right? I mean, the ideal is that the janitor knows what this company does. Everybody knows this, and that allows them to make effective decisions. They want to focus on solving problems, not implementing a pre-designed solution. The other ones is they're independent, and they make these decisions on their own. They're not waiting for you to answer an email and are like, well, twiddling their thumbs while you're waiting for them. They want to own their results, so they own their good, their bad, and the ugly. They have a lot of that ownership. And then the communication is pretty seamless. So the last part is aligned incentives. What I spent a lot of time talking about in the previous slide is the foundation to creating all of this. But if your incentives are not aligned, it's hard to develop these character traits. And then obviously, if the team is successful, there is a track record of success. They're efficient, they're productive. So now, the offshore teams, we're going to do all that, and we got to do it at a lower cost from thousands of miles away. When I put that slide together, that was the first time that I realized how hard my job was for the past 10 years. Until then, I was really busy just doing it and not thinking about this fact right here, that this is what we were trying to do, lower cost and super far away. But in reality, all of us are dealing with this and encountering this, and we still have to figure out how to create these traits in people and basically still get some sleep and not spend 24 hours on email and interaction and living in the other location. So, what are some of the challenges that we may encounter? So there are two types. There's ones that will be in headquarters, and the other ones that will be in the hub, of the location where you actually have the team. The headquarter challenges fall into two categories. You're either setting up the team to fail and you're mistrusting them, or you're poorly managing them. So actually, let me, rather than reading through this, let me ask about you guys some of the challenges that you've experienced that you believe are, kind of sabotage the success of a remote team from your companies, from your own experience. Anybody have any, yes?
Management decided to hire a whole bunch of people without telling headquarters that they've been hired or telling the remote team what their goals were.
Another one? Yeah?
I think that the local management have, concerns that they will be fighting with the teams. Even at the company level, right, the goal is saving costs. But for the US company, they want to protect their jobs, so there's a misalignment.
Totally. Any other one? Last one?
I had a successful
All right.
case hiring a Russian company to develop our icons and developed some 500 icons or so. And yeah, there were time differences and such, but both those we handled pretty well, and so it turned out to be a really good outcome.
Awesome. All right, so we'll ask you for one of the things that you did well. So I want to talk a little bit about the mistrusted part. So here's some of the things that may happen sometimes. Again, people may kind of like you said, team leadership decides that, hey, we want to save cost and there is no buy-in. There is no real understanding why we're doing this and people feel like their job is threatened. The other mindset too that I think sometimes sabotages the other team is that, hey, people believe that HQ is a little better, and this happens in companies where the primary business is in the United States. So if you're making money in the US and you understand the market, the other team inherently is at a disadvantage because they don't understand the market. And if they don't understand the market, we're better. That sort of thing can set in, and that's something that we have to be aware of to kind of mitigate. And part of being a leader and a champion of this team is mitigating these things. And the poorly managed part is, again, the processes have to be optimized for the time difference, the cultural and linguistic differences as well. If you're not optimizing those processes, you're really not creating efficiencies. So the corollary is really the same thing from the hub perspective. It's if they're set up to fail, they feel disenfranchised. And the good people are gonna leave. And the way that it really shows up in part of their culture is, they may not be onboarded, they don't understand what the values of why they're there for the company. They're discouraged for showing initiatives, all of those types of things that basically are the counterpart to what's happening in HQ can be manifested in the company there. And then the processes as well too. We want to make sure that they're efficient. If they're not, from a hub perspective, it's not going to be as efficient there. So what's the remote team effectiveness framework? This is something that we developed at Tonic over basically 10 years of failing in various different structures of team structure, reporting structure, communication structure, and every single structure. And really, it's around creating alignment and trust around all the stakeholders. And what you want to create alignment on is the culture, the mission, the roles and processes, the compensation and incentives. But most important is you want to be able to transparently measure the results. And you want to show them in a way that people are not going to be arguing with you whether these results are good or bad, and I don't trust them. So most of the work that you as the champion are going to be spending, if you have one of those teams, is creating that alignment within the organization. So actually, let's talk about the two most important folks on that team to make this happen. The first one is that HQ champion. Again, usually it's the person to whom the team reports. If that person is not the champion, we have a problem. Because again, you're reporting them and you represent them. They're really, and again, from my experience, what I found is most of the time what you spend is contextualizing their decisions to headquarters. You want to explain why things happen the way that they are. But the other, even more important part is how do you facilitate individual interactions that are outside of yourself? One of the most common things that can happen with this HQ champion is they become the bottleneck. And initially, when I was building that team, that happened to me. There was a point where I felt it's like, what's going to happen if a bus hits me? Literally, people won't know who to call. Like, if there is a downtime and I'm at the hospital unconscious, who is going to call who? And again, this was the early stages of our company, but in essence, that bottleneck was a problem and we wanted to fix it. So what I found outside of contextualizing the various actions that were taking place and the things that you needed to do was to basically monitor for the types of questions that were being directed my way and figure out, oh, you know what? You actually should be on a customer call, and then reach out to the account manager and reach out to them directly and ask them, because I know that they're going to be having a customer call with Providence Health over here, and you should talk to them. And then the account manager comes to you and says, what do you mean? You're going to put people with a Ukrainian accent on a call with my customer? No way. And so then you spend time convincing them to put them on a call because it's going to be fine, and you offer yourself, hey, listen, I'll be there for support if anything goes wrong. One call goes fine, they tell the others, hey, these guys are great at a customer call. They actually asked a lot of relevant questions. And then the other account managers and others are more willing to have those sort of interactions. But you can't be the bottleneck, and ironically, as the champion, you kind of have to push those types of interactions to make it more effective. The other thing, as important as the champion, is the actual person who is leading the team on that site. So here's an example when you don't have a strong champion. If you're basically spending more than 20% of your time on the remote location, you don't have a strong champion who you trust there. And you're compensating by traveling and trying to split your time in that location and trying to be there to affect change. That's really, really hard. It's a recipe for basically not sleeping all the time. So finding that person is really, really difficult. But once you know what you're looking for and you have a conscious process and you have the ability to hire and fire people, it actually becomes easier because again, those people exist. They want to lead. These are great opportunities for them that may not be available at those locations. And there's a lot of folks who want to be in this position. So you just have to be willing to kind of find them. And again, their job is very similar to yours, but the opposite, which is they're contextualizing what's happening in headquarters. And you're spending a lot of time talking to that person and to others. And the other thing that they're doing is they're also looking for those opportunities. Like our person actually participated in management meetings. So all the key management meetings with the C-suite, that head of the hub was on those meetings to provide that perspective from that hub, and again, take information about sales and marketing to be able to address that. And again, they were the trusted source because they had that information. So that really helped a lot to contextualize those issues. Now, we talked a lot about culture, and really what you are doing is spending a lot of time shaping culture. This was just having a conversation with my sister, who's a dentist, and she was complaining that in dental school nobody teaches her how to own a business, and in reality every dentist wants to own one. So I was thinking a lot about product management, which is the same thing. We learn how to build software, but in reality nobody teaches us how to build teams and talk to people and build culture, which is actually the thing that we spend most of our time doing. So here we are, right? We have to learn by example, but from our mistakes and experience. So let's talk, how do we define actual culture there? So for me, it's the character of the decisions that we make and the rationale that we give them. And I'm talking about small decisions like who do we invite for lunch, do we go by ourselves, who do we talk to, how do we smile, not smile, etc. That's really culture. And let's talk about how it's shaped. It's shaped by people's behavior. In essence, culture is people. And people's behavior is also shaped by something else. The major events that shape it are the major observable events that everybody looks at and then asks themselves, what does this mean? And the major ones are who you hire, who you promote, who you fire, and who leaves the company. This sends the signal for what kind of culture is at the company. Because if you're firing somebody who's excellent, you send a signal. You promote somebody who, goes drinking with the boss, that's a signal what the culture is. So everybody in reality is watching this and trying to understand what is actually going on. The other observable events, let's call them the minor observable events that are happening on a daily basis, are what peers and management pay attention to. And the kind of attention that's given. Is it positive? Is it negative? And what's being ignored? What's being swept under the rug? What are we pretending doesn't exist? All of those things really shape your culture collectively. And the unfortunate part is that people's perception of this is going to be different, and you can't fundamentally control it. But there's good news, is that really they talk to each other. Because when somebody is fired, people will talk to each other to find out and discuss and come up with a shared story of why it happened. And that becomes the truth, and that becomes the culture. So if you have a remote team, understanding this dynamic and being super conscious about the major observable events is your most important part. And the person who is the hub leader is really focusing on the minor ones. You don't know, you're not present in most of the meetings. You don't know who goes to lunch with whom or how people are treated. But if you have control, you can be very, very, very conscious of who gets hired, promoted, and fired, and making sure that the story that people tell around it are the ones that you want to be told and promote the culture that you have. So how do we actually do it? There's a few principles. Again, this is reiterating what I was trying to say. You have to do, you got to build a long-term relationship. And what I mean by that is really you're trying to own the team, you don't want to rent it. That's what I was really trying to show in the other slides when we're talking about is you want a structure in a company where you feel like you own the team, whatever that process is. Because if you're renting it, neither are you incentivized to do anything, and neither is that team, because they're telling themselves, hey, this client wants it this way, but you know what, it's going to be gone in 6 months, so what the hell do I care? They're just, somebody else. The other things that you want to start with is trust, but you want to build in a system to verify it, and we'll talk about the processes of how you verify it, both from a culture perspective and actual product delivery perspective as well. And again, this goes into conscious processes around HR and product delivery. Those are the really two main things that you want to control. Focusing on the other ones may be important, but again, the HR process and the product delivery process are the two key main ones. And then the other thing is, listen, this is a journey. You're never done. I'm never done. There's always something to improve, and you just got to come in with this assumption. The problems will continue to be, but if you're doing something right, you kind of get not easier, they just less impactful, if you will. The impact of them gets smaller. So the approach to shaping it, what worked for me was picking one cultural trait that I wanted to encourage and one cultural trait I wanted to discourage. And consciously thinking about that trait and making it the number one thing. So for me, it was initiative, was the one that I wanted to encourage, and I wanted to discourage passing the buck. Really blaming others for ineffectiveness. Again, I want to focus on one cultural trait for two reasons. If you have a broad set of them, it becomes a poster and it gets lost. But the other good news is that these positive traits and negative traits tend to cluster. Because they're clustering, focusing on one actually allows you to build the other ones. Because if you really think about the people who usually show initiative, probably they're not blaming others for their failure. So the positive ones, they tend to cluster. Now, the way that you want to do that is you got to fire and hire, demote, promote based on that trait. Or if you're building a team from scratch, you're in essence interviewing and hiring for that trait initially. The other thing is you make it a point for the few meetings that you have to constantly praise whenever the positive trait gets exhibited. If you are the main point of contact for that team, you probably have a lot of weight. And this is one of those things that I found. It's kind of like, it was interesting because of the time zone differences, I spent a lot less time interacting with the teams. And because of that, I actually had a bit more authority. What I mean by that is, when you're kind of like in HQ, everybody observes you on a regular basis when you're having a bad day, when you're not in a meeting, when you're like talking to your mom because her car broke down or whatnot, and they see you in all sorts of ways. But here, they kind of see you for 1 or 2 hours when you're basically on and you're at your best. So you have that opportunity to be at your best, and you should leverage that. I think that's actually the one positive aspect of working with a remote team is leveraging that opportunity. And again, when you praise people in those meetings for exhibiting the trait that you want to exhibit, people hear it. That's the thing. This is what people are paying attention to. This is what I need to be there. And then the most important part is promoting people around that. The process too has to reflect that to encourage those things, and then you repeat this. So HR, to hire and retain best people, you basically need to build a brand locally that attracts those people. And again, you want to build a brand if you're there for the long term. Now, this is interesting. You have a lot of opportunity there. There are typically two things that you can build a brand around. The first one is the mission of the company itself. If you have a company that is doing something good for humanity, it makes it a lot easier, so you can really leverage it. But if you don't, it's also fine, because the other thing that you could do is you could build a culture in that location and a brand around being excellent and being the best product team in that country, or the best product team in the world. That usually already attracts top talent. The other thing too that really helped is positioning that brand against what is perceived to be the dominant or negative culture in that location. So what I mean, for instance, in work with Ukraine, this is a former Soviet bloc country, authoritarianism was the kind of dominant trait, if you will. So we literally positioned ourselves kind of like against that in the job descriptions. We'd say things like, hey, looking for a person that will tell their manager they're wrong all the time. And because again, that's why we're hiring you, you know more than us. Or in countries where, for instance, it's risk aversion or other things, we want to make sure you have a bunch of relatives that don't want you to work for a startup and they only believe that you should work for a big company, but you still want to work here. So you're already positioning kind of like against there, so that the people who come, automatically you kind of like eliminate that sort of question, hey, you're not Google, why should I work for you if you're a smaller company? So figuring out that angle in that location, and actually just coming in from the job description on that is a really powerful way to attract the people that you're looking for. The other thing is, once you attracted that people, A players want to work with A players, and they kind of gravitate towards each other. And then, I keep repeating this, you got to have that control over hiring and firing people. Paying people, top market is another way, and very important one. And again, you can't really figure that out unless you understand what that market is. Yes?
So you say you want to have complete control over hiring, firing, and comp, but at the same time, A players want to work with A players. Don't you get a little bit stronger team if they feel like they have at least some say in who else is being brought into the team?
So if I understood your question correctly, you're talking about...
It sounds like there's a conflict between them. You have complete control over hiring.
Oh, I see what you mean. I'm sorry. That's not
to give some of your A players a say in who they bring to the team.
So I meant what I mean by complete control. I'm talking about you as the company. So you're absolutely right. You want to involve the A players in your team. What I'm really talking about is not having a third party that has different motivations controlled. So thank you for clarifying that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, once you have the core team, you actually want them to be doing the interviews. And over time, I removed myself from most of the interview process, and then I was the last interview, more of a culture fit interview, if you will. For all of the initial hires that we did, I was always the last one, but I never wanted to do the technical evaluation or the skill evaluation. I wanted the local team to do that precisely for the reason that you're talking about, because I wanted them to be bought into the team that they're building. Yeah, this is the right guy. So, and for me, it was like, I was kind of like a veto at the end where it's like, hey, listen, you know what, this guy may be great technically, but you know what, just something culturally is not fitting. And over time, based on the few people that I'd reject, I never got those bad apples, if you will, anymore, because the team understood, oh, this is who we're hiring. Like, this person is not going to hire somebody who's a phenomenal engineer and is rude and, has that sort of kind of like demeanor. The other powerful tool, I would say, is actually having the ability to offer stock options or other incentives that basically align them with the company performance. Again, there are many ways of doing that. We did bonus plans that were tied to stock performance if you can't issue stock to that country. But there are mechanisms, and having some sort of vested interest creates a lot of loyalty and retention. And what we found in our company was that we had about 10% turnover rate. People who basically were incentivized by stock had less than 2% turnover rate year over year. It really, really went down significantly when you offered them that. So the other key process that you have, again, most likely you've chosen the excellence route where you're helping people develop, is really using personal development as the key retention tool. So I focused a lot on the hero's journey. If you're familiar with this, this is kind of like what storytellers use to tell a good story where, you know, hey, there's a problem. Let's say a dragon shows up in the land. The hero says that, hey, he's going to slay the dragon. They slay the dragon. They get a pot of gold, or they get married in the end. Everybody lives happily ever after. In reality, the process of personal development is very similar to the hero's journey. We've got a challenge, something that we're not able to do. Somebody encourages us to rise up to the occasion. We rise up to the occasion, and there better be a reward to encourage you to repeat this process over and over again. This is actually a very powerful tool when done right, and we use this pretty consciously and when we were training our folks. And it started with really understanding their motivation, because you can't have people go on a hero journey if they're not self-motivated to do that. It's really, really hard to get somebody to go fight a dragon if they don't want to fight the dragon. So how do you elicit that? So we categorize people into 4 kind of buckets through just asking various different questions about their goals. The first one are the people who are really self-motivated, and you know, they just stand out. They're like, hey, this is what I want. This is what I want here. This is what I'm going to be in 10 years, etc. The people who have this sort of thing, you know, they're really easy to. You understand how they fit in. You understand, okay, this is how this piece, this work, this experience is going to help you move through this. So let me give you some goals around this. And when you complete them, you either get a raise, you visit to HQ, or other perk, or, you know, options, stock options, etc. Now, the other ones are the ones that were aware that they needed to have goals, but they weren't sure which ones. So those ones you have to encourage the team to work through so that they can identify and find those goals. And then the other 2 are the ones that are trickier to work with. There are people that don't believe they don't need goals, and if it was very clear in an interview process or others that that's what they believed, we tended not to hire them or fire those people. But the other one, the third one, the one with the skewed sense of goals, again, happens in post-Soviet countries or in others where there is skewed incentives. So what I mean is, let's use the hero's journey as an example. In the fairy tales, the hero goes and asks for help. He tells people what he's doing. I'm here to slay the dragon. And the people that the person that he meets gives him a weapon that he's going to use, or an elixir that's going to save him. And he's very, very open about what he's doing. The skewed sense of journey, like in the Soviet Union or post-Soviet countries, basically, when you shared information, that information could be used against you and you can end up in a gulag. So again, there are people who have that experience who are coming in and they're basically like, they have goals, but they don't want to share them with you because they don't know how you're going to use that. How are you going to turn this around against them? So it's important to understand that and to gauge whether that person can be a good addition to the team if they can see how others go through this hero's journey and to turn them around. Again, those are the folks that we would hire once you have a core team that's very strong, because they can help the others go through this. And when you basically give them a goal, you show them that when you accomplish it, they get a bit of a reward, their perspective changes, and they really become different people. And I think actually that's one of the best and most meaningful part about working with folks from different cultures is that opportunity to affect change and to change people's lives. Again, once you identify this kind of like HR process, you can formalize it. In our company, we had various different goals. They were quarterly, annual, etc., for different people at different levels. When they were more junior, we had them less, and the frequency was higher because you wanted to get the hero's journey faster. Like it doesn't really make sense to give somebody a 1-year goal or a 2-year goal or a 1.5-year goal, but something that can be done in a quarter, even a few months, to get something little that gives them that sense. All right, this is how it's going to work. But again, and it gets better. This kind of like becomes a longer process. So we talked a lot about HR. Let's actually talk a little bit about product development and product delivery. One of the things that you obviously have is a product delivery process. And from my experience, every company does it a little bit differently. There are ones that are overly structured and unstructured. And basically, when I think about a process, there are really 2 components. These formal checkpoints when you, in essence, verify the quality of work, and individual decisions that get made in between. So the important part is to figure out the balanced way, and again, I just put 3 in there, it could be 4, it could be 5, it could be 1. But understanding that of not being micromanaging versus not being completely unstructured is a very, very important part. You're going to spend a lot of time thinking about where to put the toll gates And the effectiveness of the toll gates translates into, again, your ability to sleep. Because if those toll gates are done right, you will be able to sleep. If they're not, you won't. That's really the gauge. So I'm a big fan of the Spotify model. Who's familiar with the Spotify squad framework for doing product development? Anybody? Oh, good. All right. Well, let me tell you a little bit about this one. So just talking to a few members about this, how product management is a relatively recent addition to our corporate world. And in essence, the powerful people were the engineers, because again, historically engineering, they were making hardware and stuff, and engineering were the product managers. And then product management functions got brought in. So most of the companies that we work for are a matrix structure where you have, in essence, the VP of engineering or a CTO at the top, and then you kind of have product management here across, and they have a kind of like that functional team there. We started with that. Well, actually, we started with having QA team, an engineering team, and no product team at all, and having everybody report to separately, and then various different teams would get formed depending on the project that they were doing, and that really didn't work well. Then we created a bit of a matrix structure where we still had the traditional model where the VP of engineering, in essence, was at the top, and then the product teams were matrix, but they were kind of like on the side. They were not the most important ones. And then we eventually got to the idea that we need to flip this around, because again, what we realized is the people who are building product are the ones who are bringing in revenue. Why is engineering in charge of what am I doing if the product managers really understand what gets to get built, and they are representing the voice of the customer? So we flipped that model, and we actually made the engineers more of the kind of expert leaders. So the product team is in essence the product manager or the PM or the PO was the most important person who made the hiring decisions, the sprint decisions, this. And the VP of engineering, if you will, or the QA person, the head of QA, or the other ones, the people who were iOS experts, they were more advisors. They helped those people grow on a skill level, but they did not control what they did in the team. And that team composition of who does what when was really controlled by the PM. So that's what the Spotify model really advocates for. The other thing that they focus on is that you can't have interdependent releases, because fundamentally that allows you to blame and point the finger at other folks all the time. You want to be able to have a team be independent and own the product from the very beginning to the end, so that they can own their bad and the ugly. And then having the frequent releases is kind of like as a given to iterate quickly. So I highly recommend reading it. If you guys Google Spotify Squad Framework, there's more information on this. It's super interesting, super informative, and in reality, I fundamentally believe from an effectiveness perspective, the world is moving to this model. It's just going to take some time because, again, we're coming from a culture where engineering was at the top, and it's going to take time to shift. And having personally lived through it, it's pretty difficult because I was the CTO when this happened, and in essence, I had to go to my VP of engineering and tell him he's no longer the most important person on the team. It's this other guy that we just recently hired about a year ago. I'm sorry. That's really hard because you have built those relationships, but in essence, to make the company more efficient and work on the most important things most effectively, we had to do this. And it paid dividends because it made the team a lot more effective. So I want to talk a little bit about the 3 critical checkpoints. We go on the theme of sleep. What we found to make it work is really creating formal meetings and checkpoints around these 2 things. So our product management also lived in the location where the engineers were. That's the other thing that the Spotify model advocates. If you have product management designed here, built there, you're fundamentally creating a culture where there's potentially not a lot of initiative because people are order takers. Now that's not necessarily true because you can have a very strong engineering team that can still be involved, but it's still, you have that barrier to overcome. You have to work extra hard to make them proactive if you have that kind of like designed over here and built somewhere else. So having that assumption where a product manager is in another part of the globe, and they report to you, or they can be called a product owner, junior product manager, whatever it is that you want to call them, but in essence, they make the decisions. They're making decisions while you, in essence, sleep. We want to check that they're making the right one. And the most important one was the opportunity definition review process. So instead of telling people what to build, we put a queue of tickets where we told them about the problems the customers were having. And then we asked them, based on the priorities of the problems, because this problem is very significant, that they had to create the opportunity definitions. They had to create the design for us and present it to me and to the other stakeholders in the company. Depending on what they were presenting, we would invite account managers or other stakeholders to give feedback. But they were driving that presentation. And because they were driving that presentation, they were having feedback from us. We put them in touch with the customers. They were no longer keeping me or other folks up at night, because we had that one meeting where they could work and do a presentation, and that presentation was in a PowerPoint document that could be shared, that feedback was received, and then from there they could group. In addition to the opportunity definition, we also added the design review processes there as well, because for certain things you obviously don't need that, but for the things that needed a design process, we went through it on the same meeting. So that meeting for us was every week, and it was about 1.5 hours long. Sometimes it went to 2 hours. But that was the most important meeting that we had. The other one is the prioritization, where in essence you kind of like select what it is that folks are going to be working on, and then giving the demo at the end of those 2-week or 3-week or whatever sprint cycle that you have to the stakeholders. Yes?
How do those local account managers overcome the disadvantage? They're so remote from the main target markets. Do they work over at night?
They do, so this was interesting. So in some sense, you had to do a little bit of both. We were fortunate that our customers were also on the East Coast. So because we have a lot of East Coast customers, that gives you a bit of an overlap. If all of your customers are in the Pacific time zone, and folks, it is very difficult. So yes, they have to be willing to kind of take late meetings. And in reality, I mean, in the locations that you work, I think the most senior people are pretty familiar with that. That's why they get kind of like paid a lot in relation to what they're doing, and they want that responsibility. Oftentimes, also, they believe that this is their opportunity to really understand the US market and also potentially immigrate and then move over. And so they're willing to work extra hard on that as well. So in essence, if those opportunities are there, you're right, they are the ones who are taking on the burden. But like we had a 10-hour difference. I mean, there would be the occasional meeting where they're kind of like doing it at 11 o'clock, but most of those meetings were still at reasonable hours. And I think the other thing too, that pause kind of like allowed for the kid hours, if you will, so folks worked at a time, then they went home, they spent time with their kids, and then they kind of like turned on, the computer and did some other meetings there as well. But we check with them for their availability. But you're right, they have to be motivated. There's that extra step, and again, that goes back to them wanting to learn this. There's another question here?
Is the assumption then that not only the development team, but your architecture team, your design, your UX people, they're all offshore as well? So if they're gonna do all the design of the system, because I've seen where you outsource the development, but the specifications, everything is still done, say, in HQ, because that's where you also do development at the same time.
Yeah, the assumption is basically you could do the equivalent of a standard opportunity definition process for the spec, and so we have the equivalent for the technical part. If you have teams that are dispersed, so you have HQ team and you have that team, in essence, the assumption that I'm making is if they're building it, I want them to tell me what they're going to build and how. I don't want to tell them that. If I tell them that, that means that I'm disempowering them. I'm taking away an opportunity to be creative. And if I'm taking away an opportunity for them to be creative, I'm not attracting the best people. So you can establish a review process, and in those types of situations, that kind of what ends up happening. Because again, and that's the hesitation, and that's what the champion's job is to advocate for that, is in essence create a review process where there is a company standard by which everybody has to live. But hey, why don't we try by giving the folks over there the opportunity to live up to that standard? And that's the thing that's going to surprise them, because they actually will. But the standard has to be there, so that would be what I would recommend. Because on the other option is, again, you're taking away creativity. Was there another question? Yes.
Sorry.
Yep.
I don't understand the diagram.
So yes, I was making the assumption that a bunch of you would know the Spotify squad framework. But basically, this is they have their own terminology for tribe, chapter, and guild. that they use, and then the framework, which is, again, their own language. But basically, let me just kind of like walk over there. So these would be product teams, they're vertical. A tribe would be a group of product teams that are in essence working on the same area. The chapters and the guilds are expertise groups. So this would be like your iOS developers, in essence. And this would be like your QA folks, so a guild of QA folks. And that's their terminology. But again, like I highly recommend you taking a look and reading this. In reality, it's really just, it's a matrix structure where the product is on top and the functional groups are horizontal as opposed to vice versa. Yes?
This changes your qualifications for a good product manager from what it used to be.
So what are the qualifications that they used to be that you're making the assumption? Can you tell me a little
I'm
more?
just curious, yeah, there's kind of like a more business-oriented one versus a more technical-oriented one. Now it feels like you kind of need them smashed together, which seems even harder to find.
So, not quite true. So each one of our teams that we built had a tech lead. So the tech lead is a very important part of that team composition. So usually, yeah, like either a back-end developer, front-end developer, but you need to have a tech lead. I'm not advocating that you are smashing those things together. They are more of the business person who really understands that function. They're not programmers. I think the main thing that I'm trying to say is that tech lead more reports to the product manager than to the VP of engineering. So in essence, if the product manager is not happy with that tech lead, they really have the first say of whether that tech lead stays in their team. I'll give you another example of what I mean. Recently working with a customer and working with a product manager, I was asking them about a hire. They were hiring the tech lead, and I asked them who they were looking for and what's the qualification. Basically said, hey, listen, we do need a very strong technical person, but we're looking for a person who is more interested in building product than in building the best technology. So I think in reality, this sort of mindset actually is less of a shift for the product manager, it's more of a shift for the engineers. And one of the interview questions that they ask is, they basically, this was kind of funny, I asked them, well, how do you suss that out? Because I was curious, like, I mean, how do you find out if a person, a tech engineer really thinks that way? And he's like, oh, it's really simple. So he showed me like a contact us form, and he's like, give me an estimate. That's what the question is. Just estimate the amount of time that it takes to build this contact us form. And I was like, okay, well, what happens? What are you looking for? And he's like, if a person says 1 day or a couple of hours, I don't want them because they didn't ask any questions. If a person says, hey, well, is this going to be responsive? Is it going to have to work on a mobile site? What kind of security are we going to run on this? You know, what are the validations? What are we trying to do? What happens once the form is submitted? So like basically a lot of questions before they actually do that. That person is more interested in building product. So it's a pretty simple, very powerful way in terms of gauging the curiosity of the person as opposed to like, you know, how many assumptions they make and how much, you know, assumptions they bring into the story. Yes?
How often do you see these kind of teams getting formed
In the US? In smaller organizations, more often than not. In larger organizations, it's harder. But more startups and smaller organizations adopt this model. And again, I didn't start with this. I made that transition from a frustration of there are just too many kind of like communication problems. And so, I mean, again, you can make it work the other way around, but oftentimes we make it work by having a lot of processes and, you know, spending a lot more time on ineffective things. Yeah.
That was very interesting. You mentioned about kind of a test to see if they answer. Another one, I think it was pragmatic marketing that popularized people, as I see during the interviews that I did with them. What do you like to do? And then, and we're stalling on that. A lot of things. So better yet, let me explain. Do you prefer PowerPoint, Word, or Excel? So if you said PowerPoint, you can more product marketing. If the Word, I don't know how PRDs are done anymore, but it used to be in Word, and then Excel you were quant chalk. So that was a good way of assessing exactly by what tool you use, what you.
Sure, we all have our favorite tools. All right, let me move here just for the sake of time because I know that we have a few more minutes and I want to leave it for questions. The other thing is we have relationship building. That's an important part. One-on-ones, you obviously all know this, there's no rocket science here. Offsites, travel, all of that sort of stuff. You want to travel both directions, you want folks from there to come over, you want to go there. But again, honestly, if you're spending more than 20% of your time there, you need stronger leadership in that place. So the last thing that I want to talk about before starting to figuring out how to apply this model is the tools. So there are two challenges that I encountered in my work when I was trying to do this. One of them was that I didn't know the culture, and it was really hard to figure out what that culture was because you have very limited interaction. So we adopted actually an employee satisfaction tool that measures it on a weekly basis. They just ask 2 or 3 questions in terms of various things, and they open you up for comments. And I read those things, and that was accessible to all the managers. It was completely anonymous, but it gave me a very real-time feedback on, in essence, hey, is this product hub leader, this person, are they really, as good as they are, in essence? And I had a way to measure that in terms of what the perception was of the team, what are the types of problems that they were creating or reporting. The other one was the performance measurement tool itself. So we're pretty obsessive about measuring velocity and commits. Those were the 2 things that we've measured, and we use that as a basis of comparison between teams as well, because if you have a US team, and you're measuring the same things in terms of velocities and commits, you're using the same standard, you can advocate, and that's the tool, that's the thing that enables you to build a team that is equal to, or better even than the one in HQ. And that sort of transparency creates that competition that is really beneficial. So again, there's various different tools and ways of doing this, but consciously measuring those 2 things is going to be pretty important to be able to be effective and, again, to have peace of mind, if you will. So how do we apply the framework? I mean, listen, if you're doing it for a new team, it's pretty easy. You've got to define that culture, again, those positive, negative traits, the positioning for your hiring employees, hire that first core people, and then work with them directly in that geography with the business partner to create those processes and tools. And iterate as you measure the results based on that. The more challenging one is troubleshooting. So the kind of things, basically let's talk about troubleshooting culture, people, process, and tools. From a people culture perspective, really, if the majority of the folks are exhibiting traits that you don't like and you want to discourage, you got a culture problem. It's pretty easy, right? So once you measure that, once you understand that, that's the way that you need to address it, or address. A process problem occurs, and we had that. I maniacally focused on the people first, but then it turned out that after all the great people were there, we were still not as productive as we could be. And I didn't have those gates that I talked about. I didn't give those opportunity definitions. We weren't reviewing them on a weekly basis systematically. And we needed to implement the processes. So the indicator that you have a process problem is when you really like the people. The people show initiative. Everybody's doing a lot of stuff, but you just know they're not as productive as they should be. Usually that really is a point to hey, there is something in the process that needs to be optimized to really unleash their full potential. And then the tools, again, if you don't have a way to measure the productivity or a way to measure people's basically happiness or satisfaction within the company, you got a tool problem. So how do you fix them? Culture, well, again, if you have the ability to control the people, hire and fire them, you want to be able to make these decisions. Change leadership or reboot the teams, identify training opportunities. If you think that the people are there and they have potential, that's the example that I gave you. And we had to do a lot of training. We actually invested a ton in that. And the reason was we started working with folks from Ukraine in about 2010. And found very quickly that the managers that had really grown up in the Soviet Union, i.e., they were born in the 70s, it was really, really harder for them to adopt this new kind of model. The ones that had adopted this, they were already in America or somebody else, they basically immigrated because they didn't want to live in that system, or there were fewer of those people. And the ones that were really open to working in the culture were basically 22-year-olds. So they didn't have the management experience that we wanted, so we had to do a lot of training to kind of foster and build those people up, because we understood that the people were right, it's just they were just not experienced. So that's the other part about fine-tuning the culture. And again, the results there, look, they can be faster, but 6 months is a usual good time. If you're doing something right, you're going to see some meaningful results there. On the process, you want to redesign it to encourage the right behavior and remove all those structural barriers. That can be difficult, as I talked to you about. We went through 5 different reorgs until we got it the way that we really wanted. And literally my team thought that the only thing that I lived for was reorging the organization, because we'd have a reorg every year. And each time it evolved, and then, hey, for the past 3 years or so, there was no reorg because the structure worked. And we could just scale up and down within that organization. But after each reorg, about within 3 months or so, we started seeing results. And then, listen, tools is the easiest part. You can implement them pretty easily. So I want to pause here and either open it up for questions or give you the opportunity to tell me about some of the problems that you're having so that we can kind of troubleshoot them together and figure out ways and tools that you can bring some of these things that we talk about to the challenges that you have. So either one of those things, either questions or just, hey, listen, let's do a little group collective talking about how we can address the challenges. It will be great. Yes.
Just wanted to roll back to the measurements one.
Yes.
Couple of problems. If you're measuring velocity, you gotta be careful because comparing that across teams is not a valid comparison. The other thing is measuring commits or lines of code is measuring an input, really. And rather than that, you want not just measure an output, but really an outcome. So I would recommend moving away from those as the...
What are the things that, I'm curious to hear, because this is actually another thing that everybody struggles with. Make a comment on the commits and the lines of code. I look at them as more of kind of like measuring people's engagement, if you will, because you
it's
can
activity,
in
but
essence,
is it productive?
Right, that's the question. So I am curious from your experience, what would be the things that you'd measure to measure effectiveness that, again, can't be measured systematically across globes? Yes.
So one of the challenges with my past experience working with the remote team is they don't have a local market knowledge, and it takes
Local marketing now?
local product, right, and marketing knowledge. So it takes a long time to, for example, we are in healthcare space. It's harder for someone in Taipei or India to understand how U.S. healthcare system operates, right? That product knowledge is so key.
So I'll tell you a trick that we used. One of the first things that we did for first product manager, because we're in healthcare, and it turned out that eventually this team knows more about HIPAA and American healthcare than most Americans. But one of the main things that we did is we basically told them that they need to come up and create a training document for the future employee onboarding. And they need to show it to me. And I need to review it. So that was the main deliverable. And that forced them to do a lot of research. And when it was bad, you told them so, and then they went back. And so, in essence, what I was trying to encourage was to understand that they can't wait for me to provide them the answer. I want them to do it themselves. A lot of these tools, a lot of the things that we used were really focused on. Okay, that's great. So you brought the problem to me. You don't know American healthcare. How are you going to fix it? I brought it back on those team members and I made it their responsibility. And the ones that didn't rise up to the occasions were removed. And then we found the ones that did. But that tool, that technique of making them create the training was the litmus test that kind of like encouraged that. And then over time, we built a wiki on Confluence and people trained that. There was a whole onboarding process around American healthcare. And honestly, I'm not even kidding, the product managers and the developers knew a lot about all the different regulations, and they were coming to me at some point and telling me that I'm not following some of those things that I should be. Which was pretty funny. It was like they were arguing, like I remember this, they were arguing about consent forms and they were trying to say, no, you're like, this is the way that we need to be saving and archiving these files, otherwise we're not compliant. And then they were showing some obscure document that they found on the internet, and they were right. So that's what you want. So, but it started off with telling them that they had to do it. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about how many of the challenges you see with organizations as they try to go remote and offshore are actually reflective of not just problems going offshore, but just in general building any org, like the culture things, like do we agree on what we're doing and why we're doing it, how we measure success and all this stuff. actually maybe a lot of the problems people have with offshore is we didn't get that right even onshore, and now we're trying to export it. I broke it and wonder why.
You're 100%. And that's, I mean, in reality, and I was also building this presentation, I was thinking about the same thing, because listen, at the end of the day, people are people, and there is nothing inherently different between offshore people and onshore people. The one thing that I did find is that, look, companies that don't have a conscious culture shaping initiative leave the opportunity for you to create a subculture. So I think what I'm advocating for is if you have control over that team, you actually have an opportunity to create that culture for that team and for the people who work around you. And if it's positive, I promise you're going to get the attention of others because you're going to be more productive than the other folks. It may not be on month one, but it may be in a year or two because you created that loyalty, that retention. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the challenges that I'm describing to you could literally use them to solve the problems here with your existing onshore product team because, you know, there's nothing inherently different about that. And organizations that are a bit dysfunctional, they tend to, you know, export that dysfunction, yes.
I just want to add, at some point I was working with 3 teams offshore, different countries, different cultures, working on the same product, same area. I mean, they had different responsibilities, but I really was running 3 different projects to get the same thing out of all 3 teams. It's really important to try to understand the cultural aspect of them, how they approach, what you can get out of them. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge. And like the question, you know, what can be done onshore versus offshore? Yes, people are the same, or I mean, project is the same, but how these people approach it and how they see it may be different. So you need to make sure that they see it the same way, like you want them to see it. It may need really different approaches for each of them. That's what I found kind of the most important one to deal with it.
Well, I mean, I don't know about other folks, but I mean, the bit you're talking about is like the cultural lens. It's not the culture of an organization, but actually the local culture. I mean, anyone who has, I think, dealt with India, for example, there's a very particular, like, the boss says to do something, the boss is right. I expect the boss to tell me. And probably your experience with offshore teams there in the beginning is, like, they're waiting for me to tell them to do things. And most of it is, whether it's selection or reshaping, like, yeah, that's not actually what we value here. If you haven't seen it, it's my go-to, kiss, bow, or shake hands is a cultural dictionary. It essentially tells you, and it's useful not just for this stuff, just you're gonna go to a business meeting with someone who's from a certain background. What do they value, right? Do they value quantitative information? Do they value feelings as justification for doing something? What are the things that sort of shape how they view the world? It's fantastic. And then I suggest you go look it up for your own culture. How much?
Exactly. So one of the teams were in Russia, one of the teams were in Thailand, and there was a group of actually subject experts in India and in other parts of the country. So completely different ways to get the same information out of them, out of them, and exactly for the same reason. One culture is they're waiting for the instructions from their boss. So it was mainly communication.
So one of the things that tried to do when we went and did work with those remote teams, we decided that we're not going to adopt ourselves to their culture, but we're going to give them the opportunity to learn our culture, if you will, or the best of Silicon Valley. Now, again, like you said, there's a lot of dysfunctional companies in Silicon Valley anyway, but they don't know that. They all think that everything's amazing.
I think
So it's better, yeah. So maybe my information is a bit dated. So I think in essence, that's what we were trying to do is we were trying to say that, hey, listen, guys, we realize that this is the way that you work, but here's a different model. And so I was trying to kind of ruin them for other companies, if you will, so that they get used to working in a certain way. And that example that you give them, that you gave was, I encountered the same problem. The first time that I woke up and then I got on a stand-up and the team told me that they didn't do anything because they're waiting for my input. I said to them, that's great, you do that again, you're all gonna be fired. So what you're gonna do instead is you're gonna try to make a decision and do something, and we're gonna talk about the decision that you made. And if it's wrong, I'm not gonna blame you, we're just gonna give you more information so that we course correct. And they got it. So they kept making these decisions, and from that experience, it turned out that 80% of the decisions that they made were right. And 20% were wrong. And literally within about a 6 months period, they stopped making mistakes because they had asked the questions. But I had to tell them that. I was like, if you ever wait for me again, that's for me is cause for termination. I waited for them to do that once so that I had a reason. And they experienced it. And I was like, okay, that was nice. But like, no guys, this is not the way that this is gonna work. And that's a forcing function. I mean, the other comment about like other places like India and other folks and those dominant cultures, in each one of those, there's still a subgroup that wants to work exactly the way that we're talking about. They want a meritocracy, because again, if you think about it, look, they go into those types of companies, they come in and they see who's getting promoted. And in those traditional companies, it's the son of somebody else's uncle who gets that promotion. And they're like, I am not somebody else's uncle. I'm never gonna get ahead, but I'm really smart and I wanna work hard. Well, those folks are everywhere. So you give them the opportunity to shine and remove the people who wanna have an uncle who gives them a promotion. That's really it. But so like, I really don't believe in kind of like trying to adapt yourself to that mindset, but like, this is how we're gonna do it. It's a meritocracy. This is our culture, and that culture has to be the same within the organization. Having said that, there's a lot of, not company culture, but local culture nuances that you need to factor in as you're doing that, so that it's effective and not rude. And yes, you need to understand those.
I have two questions. First one is, when you were talking about hiring and firing, how did you deal with labor laws and what kind of challenges you had with labor laws? And second one is, your premise of going with an offshore team was cost saving, but with all of this, of having multiple options, you said you've been doing for 10 years, did you realize the cost saving, or it was just a myth that you went in and eventually you should have figured out building a team here would have been more productive than building there in the first place?
I believe that we more than realized the value, and in fact, if I knew everything that I know now, we would have realized even more value because I would have implemented and not made the mistakes that I'm talking about. What I mean by realizing the value is this, it goes back again kind of like order taker versus the person who's coming up with a solution. If you really think about it, what I was trying to say is I have a product manager in Ukraine where the product manager is solving something and they're costing me between $60,000 and $80,000 a year. I can't hire a product manager for $60,000 or $80,000 a year anywhere in the United States, but they know everything and they can do those types of things, right? So I truly, really realized that value. And the other thing is that amount of money was mostly paid directly to them. So the folks there were realizing the value because there was no middle person who was taking a huge cut. They were a top job. They had influence. They listened. Their product and software were used by millions of folks in the United States. They were, built over there, but huge impact in the States. And that sort of alignment was actually the thing that made me realize the value. Where I question if there is value is when you do build the spec at home and you give it to somebody else. That's when I question why the value is there. Or the other form of outsourcing that I really don't understand is when you outsource things like QA. Like, how do you split out a function completely outside of everything and put it independently where they don't know how that's going on? I mean, sure, for very, I don't know, maybe you could do that, but I don't believe you realize value in that way. But by having them locally, by having them own the problems from a cost perspective, we realize the value because, guys, I mean, look, I'll use this as an example of where I make the argument where you realize the value. Just reading recently some history books for my daughter and learning about silk in China and the Silk Road. So China at the time when the Silk Road was established with the Roman Empire was about 100 years before the Common Era. It was as valuable as gold. And China was the only country that knew how to make silk. And silk was valued everywhere, and so that's actually why it's called the Silk Road, because the only place where you could get silk was there. And it took a couple of 100 years, and somebody stole that secret, and it turned out you can grow silk anywhere. You could grow it in Greece, you could grow it anywhere once you understand how to do it. That's the insight. Like, your value is, people are the same, you know, you look, the folks that didn't have guns, once you gave them guns in the 19th century, they figured out very quickly how to use them. You know, so you give them the tools and you give them the local knowledge, they're just as smart and just as creative. And in fact, I would say that if you give them the right opportunity, they're even more ambitious to prove themselves. Because they want to be as good as people in Silicon Valley. I think that's the advantage of how you turn it into a competitive advantage, is to leveraging them and not give them less, but give them more, with an understanding that yes, you need to provide the guide rails, but give them that opportunity to show themselves. Show that they're as good or better.
Thank you. The first one was about
Okay.
the local laws, the labor.
Oh, local laws. Oh, thank you for reminding me. So yes, and again, listen, there are various different countries that have various different local laws. You have to follow them. I mean, you don't break them. A lot of places in Eastern Europe have favorable treatment towards programmers. They have favorable tax treatment to attract and retain talent. One of the reasons is because those tend to be the higher paid positions. So like as an example, let's say even in Poland or Ukraine, I mean, again, people who get like $6,000 or $8,000 a year when the average salary is $1,000 a year, you can lower their taxes, and that's kind of like an advantage of retaining them. But part of those laws, there are differences. They can be consultants, they're necessarily not employees. So all of those nuances you have to be aware of and understand. And this is what I was trying to say, that you have to work with a company that either will facilitate that, but still provide you the transparency, or invest the time to know those laws. From a firing perspective, the way that I looked at it was less from a laws perspective, but more about, listen, because again, the thing that shapes culture is that's a very, very big visible decision who you fire. So not only are you sending a signal that bad people get fired, but you also need to send a signal to your team that you're going to be fair. So that firing process should have some sort of review where you give them an opportunity to improve themselves. And you know, that if somebody asks, hey, that person was treated unfairly, you can say, well, no, exactly. They had the opportunity to improve. You know, they were given that. They didn't rise up to the occasion. And then the other thing is, you know, obviously severance of something, so that, because people will talk, they will say that, hey, you fired me without severance, you didn't give me any opportunity to say that, and you just ruined your culture. If you are building there for the long term, I would focus less about the laws and more about how is it going to be perceived of how you're treating that person as a human being, because the people who are staying, they're asking themselves the same thing. Can this happen to me? And if it does, will I have the opportunity to stay or treat? How am I going to be treated? There was a question in the back, I believe.
Well, I was just going to share a story about what I just recently experienced today. Right? One of the premises, you have to treat each of these remote teams as equals. And I think that's where, you know, the benefit lies, right? One of the situations I had this morning was I wanted to tell the remote engineer to go and present at a conference at a panel. And it was like a complete shock, right? It was a corporate culture shock, like, hey, I think typically that's done by the product person. Why are you asking an engineer to do it? Especially from the remote team, right? And I think that, like, this is what this guy has worked on, you know, for the last 2 months. He is the subject matter expert. We should promote him. We should give him an opportunity to talk, right? This is what creates the corporate culture and, you know, helps the remote teams feel connected and get recognized. It may not be monetary, right? But it's just recognition, like, reward them for their...
A lot of those things are not monetary. So exactly, like one of the things that we did is we were working on a very big partnership with a large EMR organization, you know, that's based in the States, and they've been doing this for a long time. So we flew 3 people from Ukraine, a product manager, technical manager, and others to that meeting, and they were representing the technical side. Again, we had the same type of questions. Oh my God, are they going to be okay? But yeah, they did, and everything was completely fine. And not only was the customer happy because they, you know, they felt, hey, you have a great team. You're willing to take folks and fly them out here. They must be awesome. So I understand, like, that you have very powerful folks, but they themselves felt the same way. So 100%, the key to making this all work is about trust and treating people equally and giving them that opportunity. And you know, there's the funny part is. So if you don't have that in the organization, I guess there are 2 things. You can ask for that in the way by, creating those measurements that we talked about, and then, in essence, telling the C-suite that you're going to measure that and you're going to present the results. And one of the things I talked to another company that was doing this with support, where they have support people in the Philippines and they have support people in the United States, and they have a tool that basically measures their satisfaction, like the satisfaction at the end of every call or every ticket. And after they implemented and started measuring this, within a few months when they were reviewing the results, it turned out that the Philippines team was providing more satisfactory answer than the US team, and management freaked out. How is this possible? But you had a measurement tool that made it transparent, and you in essence gave them the opportunity. And then it forced management to improve the local team as well. But absolutely, like having that transparency, and listen, people aren't going to give you that opportunity. You'll just need to have data to back that up. And that opportunity, in essence, is all you need. All right, any other questions? Okay, yes.
I know you're trying to help a team offshore. That team will have all the skills that is built through this process. And it's doing well. But we are exporting those knowledges and practices outside. But here it is impacting the local economy, and even what happens to all the product nowadays, right? You see, what is your perspective on this?
Well, again, so I look at this from a perspective of, the world is getting more global. I think we asked ourselves about this challenge too. Listen, and I think the bigger issue in reality is probably automation. That's going to automate a lot of other jobs out of this. Globalization, I don't know. I'm not really an expert on that, but from my experience, we actually, when we started doing this, we had to hire a chief product officer in our company to really lead that sort of team. And I think this opens up for a lot more leadership positions here. But I'm also not suggesting that you only have product management completely offshore. You still need champions who understand product and business here to train those people and interact with them. And they can still have their own team over here as well. So, again, I'm not an advocate of just doing everything offshore. Plus, local teams should have local product management as well. Because you will build stuff in the United States. You have engineers here. Look at all the engineering investment that Facebook, Google, and all the other major companies are doing. That's not going to go away. There's still going to be great engineers here. They will need great product managers. I think really what I'm trying to say is that product management needs to live next to the team. And if you are going to build a team somewhere, it should have that sort of autonomy and product function. Not that we need to eliminate product management here.
You mentioned mistakes. What are one or two really big mistakes that you would warn against?
So hiring the wrong leader at the hub was one of the first ones because they ruined the culture and they misaligned incentives. I'm going to give you kind of an example. Again, the first person that we hired was really great at managing my expectations and interacting with me. And listen, he was a wonderful guy, and he was always on calls, and he was ready to talk to me at any time during the hours, and it's just so customer service centric. And
kiss up.
you know what? He didn't actually kiss up, but he just was very customer centric. He was like more of a sales guy than everything else. So that gave you the impression that that's the way that he was with others. And then the first time that I visited their hub and met the engineers and just saw him interact, I remember walking in and he sat in his own separate office that was very far away from everybody else, and everybody else kind of set up in a group, and I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting, because, a good leader kind of sits in the trenches with his folks, okay? And then as I noticed the interaction and watch other things, I was like, all right, he's creating a completely bad culture over here, and it's not going to work because, again, on the smaller things, he's focusing on the wrong parts. He's basically, and the other essence is he was positioning himself to the others as he was the most important person, that he controlled the relationship, that everything went through him, all the ideas had to be gone through him, that he was that champion. And the moment that I understood that, I literally fired him more or less on the spot. It was the hardest decision I ever made because he had helped recruit the team, And I knew that I had to do it, but I was so worried that the whole team was gonna walk because he had brought them there. And when I told myself that if they walk, I was wrong about him. And if they stay, I was right. And then for a few days, I was super nervous, I was sweating it, and nobody left. And that was I was like, all right, I made the right decision because nobody followed him, nobody felt that was it. That was the first mistake. The other one was structure in terms of, not getting to that, enabling that product management as the main thing, and being a more engineering-driven org, if you will. We just wasted a lot of cycles on the wrong stuff because of that, and we had more bureaucracy where folks were obsessing about quality and other types of controls measuring. There was just a lot of kind of like energy being spent on things that weren't actually delivering value, like you said, and the measurement tool, right? And that's kind of like velocity and the other points and other things because we want to focus on the business value that we bring. That's the thing that gives impact. But those would be the two major ones, and a slew of others on a daily basis. All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you again for having me here. I hope this was useful. Thank you again.